This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with legacy art world and crypto art world conduit anne-bracegirdle. Anne spent a decade at Christie's, where she spearheaded the auction house's Art and Tech initiative, before diving headfirst into Art+Tech at Superblue and co-founding the Art Antiquities Blockchain Consortium. She's a frequent speaker about the confluence of art and technology, and now serves as the VP of Business Development for Metaversal. At the end of the episode, I'll be taking a look at some of the week's top art headlines. But first up, Bridging the Art World Divide with anne-bracegirdle. Anne-bracegirdle, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. You have kind of been at the forefront of a lot of the conversations around art and technology for a number of years. I was wondering if you might be able to, just for the sake of my listeners, kind of give us a snapshot of your background and how you got to where we are today.
Sure, I'm happy to. And thank you, Craig, for having me on the show. I'm really excited to be here and always happy to talk about the merger of art and technology. So my background is entirely within the commercial art world. So I was an art history major and photographer in college, and then I spent about a decade working as a specialist at Christie's in New York. And in that capacity, I helped people buy and sell art, essentially. And I became fluent in the incredible inefficiencies within the art market, and became intimately aware of how difficult it is to be a buyer and a seller in the art market. And in about 2017, I discovered blockchain through a friend, and quickly realized the many ways in which that technology can revolutionize the art world, and so many of the sort of antiquated difficulties within the industry. So I spiraled down the blockchain rabbit hole, became involved in the digital art scene and community in New York, and just basically spent all of my time outside of my working hours focusing on educating myself, becoming more involved in the community. And then Christie's allowed a colleague and myself to organize a conference about blockchain in an attempt to educate people within the industry about the tech. And that was in 2018 in London. And since then, I've been involved in the space, and now I've found my way into a full-time day job focusing on NFTs. So very excited to have made it here.
How would you say your background has provided you a unique insight as to the future of art and blockchain? You come from a legacy art world, but you've kind of, and I guess that's what a lot of the conversations I'm having with people in this new NFT space is missing, is that knowledge or history or awareness of the legacy art world. It's such a new space, and so many of the players are kind of native to this new space. Can you kind of talk about your unique insight that you bring to what you see going on in terms of blockchain and art?
The reality is that I would not have become so passionate about the potential of blockchain if I had not worked for 15 years with clients, art advisors, people who were trying to sell their collections or acquire collections. If it had not been for my time being ingrained within the art world, that I wouldn't have realized the true potential of the tech. And I think unless you've been engaged in the art world and tried to participate, it's hard to really grasp the complexities and how digitally antiquated the system is overall, how hard it is to have a sense of value, right? Many people try to penetrate the art world and come to an art fair and see, a piece selling for $100,000. They look it up online. They see that it sold at auction the previous year for $30,000. And the reality of understanding how that value is created, unless you have forged close relationships with people in the gallery space, in the auction world, it's hard to really understand how it functions. And that's specifically why it is so perfectly suited for blockchain because it has functioned within this space of opacity and trust, right? It's a system and a market that is unregulated and entirely functions on trust. And so it is that sort of innate understanding that makes me sort of instinctively understand how blockchain is going to really revolutionize the art world and make it and open it up to a much wider audience.
That's one of the questions I have about the legacy art world entering this space is the question of opacity and transparency. Is the legacy art world ready for the level of transparency that kind of comes along with the blockchain? There are certain people who have made careers around knowing where the bodies are buried, keeping data very murky. Like, my value is that I can help you navigate that versus, a blockchain is very transparent. And so do you think there will be resistance from the legacy art world in terms of just how transparent the blockchain is? Or will they really embrace, the ability to manage all this data and, have real-time transparency about provenance and those sorts of issues?
What they're already open to that we're seeing is a willingness to engage suddenly this new group of collectors who have never participated in the traditional art world, but who connect deeply with NFTs, who are very comfortable with crypto, and now suddenly provide access to this new buyer pool that the art world has never seen before. And that's naturally compelling and interesting. And so that, I think, and we're already seeing that, right, with Sotheby's opening a new metaverse platform, and obviously Christie's has been providing a lot of support for NFT projects and a lot of NFT events. And I think there's also, clearly a willingness to consider what the potential of NFTs have as a medium. I think we're a long way from many of the legacy institutions really understanding what success means for an NFT project, but there's clear interest in looking into that. And much of what makes an NFT project successful is how conceptual it is, and that I think can resonate really well with people who have an appreciation for modern art, for conceptual art, etc. So I consider this movement that we're in right now to be a gateway for the industry to wrap their heads around how the technology can benefit everyone in other ways. I genuinely believe that if there is more transparency with regard to provenance tracking and value consolidation, I imagine the industry being, opening up to a much wider audience and people feeling a lot more comfortable buying art, starting a collection. So if that's going to result in galleries and artists having more people know their work and interested in it, then then all the boats will rise. But I think it's going to take some time for people to recognize that, okay, so blockchain has provided a new medium for this digital art, but let's also take a step further and look at the technology itself and what else it's capable of.
In the legacy art world, there are public auctions, and then there are private sales through galleries and art dealers. And the auctions seem pretty democratized, but the private sales are usually very restricted. I'll talk to late career artists, and the thing that they're most concerned about is their legacy getting into museums. And what they've always been told from their gallery is, we're not going to sell your work to every collector. We're going to sell it to the right collector, the collector that intends on moving your work into museums. And so a lot of galleries, even if you had the money to buy a particular piece, they're not going to sell it to you. I'm just wondering, do you feel the blockchain will aid in democratizing this process, or do you think these exclusionary processes will carry over to this new space?
I think at a minimum, having transparent provenance and transparent values consolidated throughout the market will expose an artist's work to more people, which I think will expand the potential buyer pool and provide more access to more people, which I think an artist would agree that they would be interested in. Naturally, there is still a role to play for that dealer who is going to help the artist in, seeking a relationship with a museum and finding, spaces for them, for their work, for the artist's work to be in a museum's collection. So I think there's still a role to play for guidance within the market that dealers provide to artists, but it's hard to say. I'm not entirely sure how we'll see the level of control play out. Whether, much of the industry will embrace a permissioned blockchain first to ensure that they have that sort of, a tighter control over who ultimately acquires the piece. I think that's to be seen, but at a minimum, I do believe that it will, quote, democratize the process more, and it'll provide significantly more access for more people.
I read an article earlier this week about Constitution DAO's effort to buy a copy of the U.S. Constitution at auction. And I know this falls more into the category of collectible, but the fact that 20,000 people kind of came together over the course of just 3 days to raise $47 million to bid on something seems like a radical shift. Can you talk a little bit about how the blockchain will challenge our preconceptions about what we define ownership of art to be?
What's interesting is that currently there are people, for instance, groups of dealers who come together and buy a piece of art collectively. So interestingly, that sort of collective purchasing has happened previously. But again, if you think about the reasoning behind why they would do that, ultimately it's to benefit say there's 3 dealers, it's to benefit them. They're going to sell it together. The 3 dealers will provide the funds of the eventual next sale. But what was so beautiful about Constitution DAO was the reasoning behind why they wanted to purchase the Constitution, basically the acquisition of that being symbolic of the ethos of Web3. And so the reasoning behind why they wanted to collectively own this piece was a drastic shift from a general sort of just commercial enterprise. It was entirely to keep the document for the people, to house it in a museum for the people, and an acknowledgement again of what people find to be one of the most beautiful elements of the future of decentralization and Web3. And so I think the reasons behind the why of ownership are evolving in real time. And I think that's incredibly exciting.
So tell me about your current day job with Metaversal. What does Metaversal do?
So Metaversal, we have 2 arms of our business. On the one side, we are an investment company. So we invest in iconic NFT projects. We also invest in startups that are enabling the metaverse. And by that, I mean we invest in startups that are creating infrastructure to build the future of NFTs and the future of the metaverse. And we're also investing in nonprofits that do the same. And the other part of our business is our studio. And the studio co-curates and co-produces NFT projects with artists, creators, brands, basically anyone who holds IP and isn't quite sure how they want to translate this IP or their legacy into the future of NFTs, into the metaverse, and they need a partner in doing that. And the way in which that studio is related to the investment arm of our business is that we take on the risk capital when we engage with partners. So we cover the cost of production and really manage the entirety of the production and execution process in collaboration with the partners. So we're not a platform, we're not a fund, we're not an advisory firm. We're really partners in helping bring content essentially into the NFT space and into the metaverse more broadly.
Well, the conversations I've had with folks, on the art side, my impression is that this is how the legacy art world is going to enter this market. It's through collaboration and through, like what I try to equate it to our notions of fabrication in the legacy art world.